and I'm the moderator. I play in a band called Big Star, and I manage Ardent Studios in Memphis, Tennessee. But I'll just ask people to introduce themselves and say a little bit about what you do.
Hi, my name is Otis. I am a recording engineer and a producer. I have returned to New Orleans after going through the studio system in Los Angeles during the late 80s and 90s, and currently producing local artists here in New Orleans as well as people back in Los Angeles. And I'm not specifically associated with any studio. I am freelance, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
My name's Scott Bomar. I'm a producer, engineer, film composer from Memphis, Tennessee. Recording is my absolutely favorite thing in the whole world to do. I'd rather be nowhere else than in the studio recording. When I started doing more film scores, that's kind of when I started to have my own studio, because I had to make a lot of demos. So I have a studio called Electrophonic, but I also work in other studios. I'll do things at Ardent, where Jody works, great facility, and sometimes work with Willie Mitchell over at Royal Studios in Memphis, and I've worked at studios all over, but I love to record.
Hello, my name's George Piazza, and I've been in a band called Tabula Rasa, a New Orleans-based band for many years, and worked in various commercial studios over the years as well. And I currently am the engineer at Virtual Audio Studios, and which started as a vehicle to record my own group, and we started to branch out and record other artists, and now we do that. We do some mastering, and I have to agree with. I'm sorry. Engineering is just a wonderful thing to do if you're into it. So anyway.
Yeah, we were just discussing, what topics we might cover on this panel, but I think what I'll do first of all is, does anybody have any questions related to production and engineering? Rather than assume that we know what you want to hear and what you want to talk about. Oh, sorry. What would you like?
I've actually been doing a good bit of that lately for a couple of clients, and it's the approach is a little different. I mean, the end goal of, you said mastering specifically. The end goal of mastering is the same for any album, to get all of the songs sounding coherent together, like they belong together on a record, to deal with any flaws. But R&B, rock, folk music, each one, there are different emphasis, whether it be maybe a little more low-end energy for R&B and so forth. But each genre really, for engineering and mastering, I think the engineer or producer has to take everything, take that into account, what they're trying to achieve, how to present the artist and their genre in the best light. I mean, that's the ultimate goal of engineering and producing any artist. And of course, the genre of music will dictate a lot of that, what equipment's used, what approaches are used. the interaction with the artist as well in the studio. I think anyone on this panel will probably give you a slightly different answer based on their what's available to them, their experience, and so forth. I think good results can be achieved with high-quality plugins. That's not to say anything negative about hardware, of course. It's the plugins are getting better and better. So it's doable, definitely. It takes a little more finesse, though. It takes a little more effort to really know the limitations. Each piece of gear has its strengths and limitations, and that goes for plugins as well. So experience is a big factor with that.
Sure.
Is he a mastering engineer as well? That was one thing I was going to mention in this panel is I was going to recommend to everyone to have their record mastered, because a lot of people, they make their record and they're like, what is mastering? Do I need to have my record mastered? And I know there's a lot of people that don't. It's kind of somewhat of a area of the process that a lot of people don't know much about and aren't sure about. And I just think the fact that you're going to have someone master it is very important. But if he's also a mastering engineer and he has the right equipment to do that, then
I don't know what he's using for mastering. We're using radar for recording. We use the radar system. That's pretty cool. Which I like. Especially that radar and more analog sound. That's pretty useful.
Yes, I like the way radar sounds.
Yeah.
And you can transfer to Pro Tools if you have to.
Yeah.
And it'll still sound good.
Is David Farrell good mastering engineer? Anybody knows a whole lot about what he's doing?
I don't. Sorry.
He does a lot.
This is a 30-year-old experience, or maybe a 35-year-old experience, maybe 37. But at any rate, I'm in a band called Big Star, and we released some records in the early 70s. But the guy that engineered those records and mixed them, John Fry, also was part of the mastering process, along with Larry Nix. And maybe it was more important back in those days, because John could lend a pretty specialized ear to actually, mastering vinyl and the tricks and the challenges that were faced there, as he knew what the record was sonically and where the peaks and the valleys were, and could kind of steer the mastering process to kind of accommodate those. I don't know that maybe it's not so important now, but I know that we benefited from that. But having said that, I don't know that John Hampton's a wonderful engineer and a great mix engineer, but he doesn't master his own work.
Could I add one thing to that? The main reason most artist engineer teams choose to go to an outside mastering place is, actually there are several factors. One is you get so immersed in recording, developing the music, and you spend so much time with it that you're familiar with every track, every word in the vocals, and you start over time to lose that kind of fresh ear objectivity. And another factor is that you're working on a certain set of speakers, maybe several, in the studio you're recording your record at, and no set of speakers is perfect. No room is perfect. So there are going to be subtle things that might get away from you. They may be very subtle, but just a little bit too much energy or emphasis in a certain frequency, or something's a little too jumpy, and so forth. So using a mastering engineer is definitely a big plus for all those reasons. I'd also add that there's an unfortunate trend in mastering these days about getting things so loud that it's taking the dynamic impact out of the final product. A CD's got an absolute limit, and people are just squashing things to where there's no dynamics, and it sounds almost distorted, you know. But it's my hope that that trend backs off, that, you know, starts going in the other direction a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Really good engineer would like to take their product to a mastering engineer and have the mastering engineer say, yep, it's good. A conscientious mastering engineer will listen to an excellent mix and say it doesn't need anything, instead of imposing something upon it just because it's been brought to them. So that's that. If that helps answer your question.
I'd like to add that to simplify the whole thing, mastering at the end of the day is absolutely the most important thing that happens to your CD at this point, or MP3 or whatever it's going to be. And just remember, you get what you pay for. And also, I actually have a relationship, like I've used the same mastering guy for 6, 7 years. So all I do is just send it to him. I know he's great. I can say stuff like, put some more shine on it, or the vocal's not loud enough, or push the guitars back or pull them forward. You did something just a little bit wrong. But it's just that final, most people don't understand it, but it's just that final EQ and compression of the whole thing to make it able to go on the disc. And if you're getting something for like $50 a song, I mean, there are exceptions to the rule, but I mean, it's an expensive. It can be expensive to get yours. It can cost more than making your whole CD. Get your CD mastered sometimes, like $3,000, something like that. Just to get somebody like, I use Sterling in New York. They're really great.
Isn't that Bob Ludwig's place? George
No.
Marino.
It's I use a guy named Ryan Smith who was under what's the super famous guy that's there that masters everybody. They got like 8 guys. It's a wonderful place. It's a wonderful place. There's lots of good places, but get it done. Don't skimp. Don't skimp on mastering. You'll be surprised. Very surprised.
Yeah, I think there are approaches to mastering that a lot of folks use or has become popular over the years, and I think there's a backlash to it now, but it seems to dress the music in the same clothing. So regardless of what you feed it, the mastering engineer, it will come out in the same clothes as the guy that's music that was submitted to him, the day before. While there are different performances and different personalities, sonically it becomes the same thing as so many other pieces of music out there. I don't know if I'm saying that quite correctly, but it's making something very loud on vinyl and destroying the dynamics or removing those of a recording, I think becomes fatiguing to your ears. I think those recordings will have a much shorter shelf life. And while they may have some value to the first listen, as they're kind of hyped up or something, I think that diminishes over a period of time. Me personally, when things get mastered loudly, I can't really experience the music. You can't kind of walk around in it. It comes as a one-dimensional wall at you instead of being able to turn it up so that you become, you kind of step inside of it. So, I'd be careful about that when mastering. A lot of mastering engineers actually don't like it, but they'll do it to please their clients.
I think what Ovis said about having a relationship with someone is really important. And that goes for engineers you use, studios you use, musicians you work with, session musicians. If you have relationships with different people, and you've worked with them enough to know what to expect, to know the parameters, to know, if you ask them, can you make it sound more purple, they know what that means. And that's super important when you're, I think, making a record, is just having people who you're familiar with, and you know that they can do what you need to do. One thing that, for me, and this is actually in the process before you master. It's kind of like the opposite end of the process, but one thing I've really noticed, it almost doesn't matter, the equipment, how you mic things. Two really important things I've noticed in recording is arrangements and the musicians. If the arrangement is too busy and things are clashing, it doesn't matter how well it's recorded. It's just gonna not sound as good as it could, unless simplifying arrangements or working on arrangements of songs is super important. Also, I would say, the musicians who you have come in and play, it's if you have the budget, it's really worth hiring the absolutely best musicians you possibly can, because it really, if you have a drummer who doesn't keep really steady time, or who has a drum set that doesn't sound very good, or is not used to the studio, it doesn't matter what you do after that point. It's not anything you put on top of that. It's, if you don't have a good foundation in the beginning, it's going to be shaky from that point out.
Along those lines, with regard to engineering, my boss, John Fry, the guy that engineers the Big Star stuff, was doing an interview with somebody in France, and I just heard a response of his come out of his office, and it said, "Well, we had good players and they had good instruments." And then later on, I asked him about that, and he said, "Well, the question was, how did I get the acoustic guitar sounds for the Big Star records?" And he said, "I just told the guy, we start with a good guitar and a good player, and it makes the process much easier." So that is really where you start, a good player, and it doesn't, and that's a broad term, a good player. It can be, whatever the guy's or girl's performance is and how that enhances the song. It doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect performance if that's what the song calls for. But whatever fits the personality of the song. Sometimes you can get a killer player in on a song, and he doesn't quite have the performance personality for that song. It can be the wrong thing.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I agree. The most important thing is the performance. The magic happens in front of the microphone. if you can record 40 tracks, but if they're all mediocre, it's 40 tracks of mess. And so you want to get the best performance you can. And of course, if you're an artist or a group and you have a relationship with an engineer, that's going to help immensely because you establish a kind of like working dialogue and a sense of trust, mutual respect. So there's a comfort level that's reached that helps that. But let's see. Anyway, sorry.
Okay.
My wife and I are recording an album, and we were actually discussing going into the studio, planning to try to work. We've been practicing at home anyway for several months. And then my idea is to hand it off to a mixing engineer, uh, be there during the mixing. She wants to be there all the way through into the mastering. She wants to be sitting next to the mastering engineer and telling him where to set faders and all this other stuff. And me, I'm just the opposite. I want to hand it to the mixing engineer, sit there, guide him along, and then hand it off to the mastering engineer and just give him notes, like where we want points and stuff like that. I was just wondering, about your views on three different ideas.
Interesting. If you trust the guy mixing it, I personally would keep my hands off until he had a mix-up. And I'd say, I'd make some comments, but you got to be careful. Unless you have a great deal of experience of that, whatever you start changing, all of a sudden starts changing other things. If you change the frequency of one thing, it affects how you hear the other things. If you change the level of it, it affects how you hear the other things. And, I don't know how much mastering experience she has, but, that can be a dangerous thing, too. I'd pick somebody that you trust and, that you have some experience with or knowledge of, or they've mastered a CD that you think sounds great, and just let them do it. I certainly wouldn't micromanage it while they were doing it. You might make comments at the end of their efforts, but I got to tell you, it can be a dangerous thing if you're a novice going into that and you're making those kind of calls.
Yeah, people like to work alone for a while. Generally, like somebody's going to mix, they're going to be sitting there and you're going to be bringing up stuff, and somebody's going to go like, well, I don't want that, and the guy's going to be like, you don't know what I'm doing. I'm listening to this by itself for whatever I'm trying to put together in my head, and people don't get that sometimes, and it becomes like a distraction, and you usually need to give a mix engineer quite a few hours and then come back and go, you can go then, oh, you got it all wrong, you need to change this and that, but you got to give them a little time to, get it together and figure out what's going on, or mix it yourself,
And my thinking is, hey, I've been working at this for, months, years, and I'm listening, like you guys have said, I'm listening to it for hours and hours on end, and after a while, my head starts throbbing, and I don't know where to go. And so when I come back to it, I'm fine, I can, but then when I get it out of my hand, that's a fresh pair of ears, and I want a fresh pair of ears at each stage. So that, there's a clean effort. I don't know whether that makes any sense.
Yeah, you get in a studio with a band that's new to the process, and if the guitar player's kind of leading the engineer and the mix engineer and stuff, he has a tendency to think that the guitar's not loud enough. Me personally, I played drums, and when I was 17 and in the studio listening to stuff, I didn't think the drums were loud enough. But and in retrospect, I'm really glad that I didn't speak up and say anything, because I mean, they're where they need to be. Louder doesn't necessarily mean that anything rocks harder is better. It's you just need to trust the engineer. But having said that, from time to time, people do come in, even if they are a novice at it, and they can add a different perspective on things. No, I haven't tried that. Let me try that, and it can work. But it just depends on the relationship and how much time and how much money you have. Oh, sorry. Speak into the microphone.
You guys are all producers and engineers both. You like, when you start a project, you plug in a both, you engineer this project that you're producing, or do you bring in other people? And then do you follow the project through and ask them also?
I've got to admit, I'm not an engineer, and I've co-produced one thing in my life, but I've been part of enough projects and seen the process enough to be able to make comments of it. Let me speak to that real quickly. It seems that in this day and age, with the democratization of the recording process and production and distribution and all that, and the decrease in budgets that people have to record, because there's a decrease in CD sales and even music sales in general, from people sharing and not paying for it. It behooves you to be a producer and engineer, and I got to tell you, and have a home studio to begin with, because people will come to you and say, "I have $2,000 to produce 10 songs," and if you're a producer engineer and you have something that's a little set up at home, you can do that and potentially still pay your mortgage payment or your rent. But outside of that, once you start dividing chores or responsibilities, and you have a producer and you have an engineer, then you start talking about it raises the budget of the project up, and frequently beyond what somebody will have. I would say producer, engineer, player, songwriter, arranger. I mean, if you can do all those things, you're going to be much better off, because you can deliver something for much cheaper than if you have a division of that labor. But and once you start seeing some success and some sales and that sort of thing, then you can actually take your project to a room that you think sounds good. And one of the great things about Arden is that, and you were talking about plugins and stuff, is you can come to a studio and a space that is a unique sound. If you come to Arden and you work in Studio A and you take advantage of the room, nobody has a plug-in of that room. So you walk away with a sound that's pretty unique to your project. It may, in some form or fashion, be similar to something else that was tracked in that room, but it's not a processed sound as in a plug-in that 100,000 people have. And you can also plug into a piece of analog gear, vintage gear, and it has a particular sound to it that not 100,000 people have. So while you may not consciously identify these sounds and the sonics of something, it you can hear things that don't sound interesting to you because you've heard that same sort of sonic processing in 8 million recordings, as opposed to something a little more unique and a little more kind of analog in a sense that it's a real room or it's a real piece of gear or that not everybody has. And I think I'm wandering off on this subject, but
Yeah, well,
right, yeah.
I was just curious how you guys work going through that. You take on a producing gig.
It's nice to have somebody to help you out that you can trust, you know, because you're trying to do a lot. You're trying to keep your head wrapped around, like if you're tracking a band, you got five, you know, potentially five people cutting up, having a great time while you're trying to, you know, get everybody together and make sure that everybody's tuned and everything. But you know, it helps to be an engineer because you can look over and be like, dude, what are you doing? Why are you using that piece of gear? That's not what I would do. Can you change it? But it's kind of like having a second engineer, but you really want him to be like a first engineer if you can. It helps, but it's, you know. But then eventually, you're engineering. I mean, I engineer my vocals. Like, I don't have to have anybody come in and set up my mic and do my compressors and do all of that because it's just me and a vocalist. It's just I'm able to concentrate on that. But when it's tracking drums and doing stuff like that, it's always nice to have somebody to help out, at least to get you started anyway. You know.
yeah, things have changed dramatically over the last, say, 20 years, 30 years. I mean, the Beatles knew next to nothing about the technical aspects of engineering. They were dedicated to writing songs and playing them and thinking up of neat sound ideas to lay on top of them. Of course, their producer, George Martin, had a lot to do with that as well in terms of orchestration. And these days, unless you have a big record deal, you don't have that luxury, and you have to, most people have to get more involved in the engineering and production aspect of it. And of course, that comes down to experience, you know. The more you record, the more you learn what works, what doesn't. And younger people who have a laptop and they're doing track by track, at least they're learning. You know, they may not make the greatest product in the world, but they're learning processes that if they are writing good songs and they get to a point where they can go into a more well-equipped studio, they'll have a better handle on what's going on around them. So all of these things are trade-offs, definitely. But to get back to something that Jody was saying, one of the things about any given studio, as opposed to recording in a bedroom, is the room sound, especially if you're going to do something like, say, drums. The sonic imprint, the acoustic sound of that room is going to play a large role in the way the recording sounds, and that's something definitely to consider. And yes, it's something that you really can't duplicate with plugins, even with convolution reverbs, whatever. But yeah, that's, you know, if that's what you're going for, if you want a more organic sound and you want it to sound good, then, and you have the budget, then you might want to look for at least recording things like drums in a bigger studio. Then, you know, maybe you could take them home and lay vocals or bass or whatever, things that are, you know, you can do close miking and the room sound is less of a factor, you know. But another thing, though, is a lot of the great records have been recorded with the whole group playing together. And they might go in and fix things and replace parts or add parts, but there's an energy, if it's a group, a performing type group, there's an energy that is achieved when the musicians are feeding off of each other that you just won't get if you lay down a drum pattern or, you know, program a drum machine and then lay down a bass and build it that way. You know, the drummer is going to be affected by the vocals, so even if you're not trying to get a keeper vocal, you know, it's good to have everyone there all participating to get that extra bit of groove and energy. Mhm. And that goes back to another point that was made earlier, that it doesn't matter how good your equipment is. If the performance is mediocre, then it's very difficult to get a high quality, you know, end result from that, you know. So definitely.
And you know, and also having the best equipment you can have doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to sound great. I mean, there's no substitute for someone who's, you know, has a lot of experience and is well trained. And I mean, I've heard some of the best vocals I've ever heard have been recorded by engineers. They were just great engineers and knew great mic placement, and they weren't even using any compression or anything. They might have had like a Shure SM57 and just knew the perfect place to put it, and it just sounded, it's like the best thing you've ever heard. And that's, you know, one of the things about where Jody works Ardent that's so amazing is how everyone there is so well trained. It started with John Fry, who could tell you the frequency response of every microphone in the studio and just knows everything about every piece of equipment there. And he taught John Hampton, and John Hampton has taught Jason Latshaw. It just goes down. You've got these guys, when you go in there and work, and the best studios are that way. The people in the facility they just know the equipment so well. So you're working with someone who it's just what they do, and they're so well trained and so professional, and there's just no really substitute for that. And guys like that can make a great recording with it. The equipment's kind of secondary. It's their ears and their experience that you're really paying for when you go, you know.
Thank you, Scott.
I haven't heard the Dre headphones yet, but if you're doing hip hop, you might want to check out the Dr. Dre $300 battery powered headphones. But ultrasone is the best I've ever heard. But for your home studio, for like, you talking about just for like mixing, or for like doing vocals, or what are you talking about? Anything's good for that. AKG, I think,
AKG.
is about. There's these gold ones. They're AKG and they're gold. They have gold rings on the side. I don't know what the number is.
242s.
That's what everybody has, like at a professional studio. They've usually got a pair of those.
What's your headphone send going out of? What are your signal that your cue signal that you're sending out to the headphones? What are you using for that? Because sometimes your whatever amplifier you're using is also really important.
All I know is you don't need a good headphone amp with those, because apparently they have a little battery to preamplify for the headphones. So like, do you have like a Pro Tools system or something that, or like, or an all-in-one recorder? That's not that great of a headphone amp in those, that you just plug in on the top. It's not enough power to power. It's going to distort eventually. It's no matter what. So yeah, another preamp, a headphone preamp is a good investment as well. But you're looking at, nice chunk of change to do that.
There's a Behringer headphone thing that costs like $100, and I've had a couple of those, and those actually work real well and don't distort, and they're pretty cheap.
Okay.
How would you pick a mastering engineer for your first project?
If you're talking about someone that lives where you do, it, um, I would say find a CD they've mastered. I'd find 4 or 5 to have a listen. We have a mastering engineer at Arden's guy named Larry Nix. It's an independent service. He's not an Arden employee, but Larry was the original mastering engineer at Stax. When they stopped farming it out and hired somebody, it was Larry Nix, and he's had a mastering facility in the Arden building for as long as I can remember. Gets a lot of work, hip-hop, a lot of different things. This Big Star box set and this Chris Bell reissue, John Fry would go in and kind of co-master stuff with Larry. And actually the early Big Star stuff, John Fry co-mastered with Larry Nix.
If you can't afford a established mastering engineer who's going to charge, premium rates, there are a number of experienced engineers who are breaking into mastering, would be willing to take a track and do a sample for you, just so you can determine whether or not that person has the chops and has the understanding of what you're looking for. So that's another option. I've done that for a few people just to get them in the door, and it's it's the nature of the business these days that a lot of people, and the economy, of course, that there are definitely people out there who'll do that. So.
Do you have his phone number?
Yeah, phone number. Okay.
He just helps you out. He's not trying to make money off of it. He's not even asking you for a large percentage. He's trying to attach you a guy and keep you cool with it. And he just said, I'm going to help you out with this. Trying to do it. He really don't want to. I've been playing for like 25 around all those people. And I kind of want to get off the wall. I've wrote records. I've been working on records for LPM. And I kind of recorded something and brought it here last year, got some good review or whatever, and then I said, I don't know this guy. So I come here and talk to him like crazy. And started writing some new stuff, like some really cool like soul blues, funk, kind of stuff. And I'm really happy with the material that I'm putting together now. It's looking like a great piece. So,
It's a good sign.
so I'm really excited about doing it. The price is not really a big deal. I don't want to cost them too much money. I think I'm probably going to use about 20 bucks a month and get it out, just to get a national copy.
I would just get out your favorite records that you think sound really great. Just look at the credits and find out who mastered them, and I would bet that you'd start to see some names that kept popping up as mastering engineers, and maybe call them.
I like Harlan also and Robbie Poole. I like some guys that do
find out who did their stuff.
And I would suggest that when you get these people on the phone that you do not say the budget's not a big deal. Sure.
I have kind of an ignorant question here, but when you're handing something over to be mastered, what are you actually handing them? What are you giving them? In other words, it's just they come to the studio where you've done it and then do it, or do you actually hand them a tape, or do you hand them a CD, or do you hand them something that has all the separate tracks?
Well, it depends on how you record. Well, how you mix it down. Whether if you're in the digital domain, then you want to make a mix down at the highest quality you can. I don't want to get too technical, but whatever sample rate you recorded the song at and the largest bit depth, you don't want to make a 16-bit 44 kilohertz file if you recorded at a higher sample rate and bit rate. You don't want to reduce the quality before you bring it to them. Of course, a lot of engineers will also mix down to analog tape, and that's another alternative if you're in an environment where you can do that. Actually, a common thing to do is to go both ways. Make a mix down analog tape as well as a digital mix down, and then decide which mix is better for each song, or let the mastering engineer decide. But if you're recording entirely in the digital domain, then usually you want to render at the highest sample rate and bit rate that makes sense with, in terms of how you recorded it and what system you're working with, because some of them have, more limitations. Others, some of them are limited to 24-bit, and other ones can do a higher, bigger word length or whatever. So, and then make a data disk if it's digital, not an audio CD. Because that preserves an audio CD has an inherent limitation already. I mean, that is your end product, but when you're sending the files to get mastered, if it's digital files, then you want to make data files, because you won't be able to make a 48 kilohertz 24-bit CD, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
If you make audio at a lower, it's probably be a 16-bit or something.
Yeah, well, CDs are 16-bit at 44.1 kilohertz, and
The highest sample rate, bit depth, or whatever.
yeah. I mean, you don't necessarily want to increase the sample rate. If you already recorded at 44 kilohertz, you don't want to necessarily up the sample rate. You're not going to get any greater quality by doing that unless unless you use certain equipment or mix it through analog gear and then record it back into record the mix down back into a workstation. Then you can record that mix down from the analog mix in a higher bit rate, a higher sample rate, and there's an argument that will give you a better quality. Does that make sense? How are you doing it? Is it all digital, or?
Right now, I'm just doing all my stuff just on home, just all digital. So that's pretty much what I'm doing.
Have you?
I'm at 16-bit right now, but I haven't really done it in earnest. I'm just doing more just musical ideas at this point, rather than doing the serious recording.
When you make a mix, is it a feature like render or something like that how do you make a mix? Do you hit the render button or something like that, or?
Right now, I'm just doing cakewalk and just doing, you know, maybe the 44 kilohertz. This is the CD quality recording, and then when I'm just mixing it all down to one wave file, so it's a WAV.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much all I'm doing at this point.
Whatever that in your workstation, whatever the mix down function is called, render or bounce or whatever, there are usually choices for the sample rate and bit rate, and that's where you'll have the opportunity to, especially I'm sorry, I say bit rate, but it's word length is the more accurate term. That's where you have the opportunity to keep the word length longer. What that does is keep the more ambient information and more dynamics. And then the mastering engineer has more information to work with instead of throwing it away.
Yes, I think that we can do 24-bit 96 kilohertz recording. Is that probably just best to do it that from the get-go, and then I guess somebody else can.
Those are all things that are still, people still argue over them, whether higher sample rates are meaningful, particularly. Since we can't really hear past 20 kilohertz anyway, and a CD can represent frequencies beyond that, there's an argument that it shouldn't matter, but then there are other arguments that because of the way digital does its processing to record at a higher sample rate has other advantages. It gets a little complicated, anti-aliasing filters and all this crazy stuff, but at least my understanding is if you record at 48 kilohertz, you're close to what a great quality, the best quality you can get. Although other people would argue that a higher sample rate like 96 is better, but you're going to take up more disk space too, and limit how much you can do, in the mixing process because of computer power and all that craziness. It's a whole can of worms, really. But I wouldn't sweat that too much. But when you go make the mix down, surely don't throw away bits, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's going to MP3 file anyway, it seems these days, so I wonder if that makes all this, high engineering that goes in, you lose so much if it becomes an MP3. And being the devil's advocate, how do you answer something like that?
It would depend on who the listener is, I would think. The average listener of whatever kind of music you produce is somebody that uses an MP3 player, then that's one thing. But if your audience is more of a, lack of a better word, higher end audience, then I think it would matter.
Let me ask you, would you create separate mixes to one to CD or DVD, and one to go to MP3 or other compressed medium?
I wouldn't personally, but I've never really needed to.
You could do it. I mean, yeah.
It's interesting. When you said that, though, it reminded me of being in the studio in the early 70s when people were listening to, radio was monaural or mono, and at least the AM stations. And so you would not only have a set of stereo speakers, you would have one cheap little speaker that would represent a car speaker, car radio speaker. So you could in effect mix to what was coming out of a car radio, too. So I mean that there was that consideration back then. I don't know that anybody does that now, but probably
Still
not.
take it to the car.
I
Yeah.
check
You
my
still take it
mixes.
to the car, but it's not mono. It's car
they don't.
stereo.
I check my mixes in mono, definitely, in case they're going to be played back somewhere in mono. You never know. And especially if you're doing something like soundtrack work for television, a lot of televisions have mono speakers, right? So, I mean, I know you do a bit of that, huh?
I always check, at some point I always check a mix in mono. It's good. It folds it all down. You can tell if there's any phase problems or anything, and it gives you a better reference of where the bass sits. And I mean, but as far as making a mix or a master specifically for MP3, changing something, I think most people are just trying to get something that sounds absolutely the best it can, and you know, the MP3 compression happens after you have the best sounding master you can make.
I'll tell you one thing about MP3 is if you do that loudness, maximum loudness thing, the encoder has a hard time with it. And so if you make a master that's just cranked, there's no dynamics, and it's at the maximum level that a digital file can be at, that chances are the MP3 won't sound very good. So you want to leave, or you want the mastering engineer to leave a little bit of room there, and the encoder will treat it a lot better.
It would be kind of cool if the mastering engineer would give you had a way to give you some super high quality created MP3 for you to put out there, as opposed to like sticking your CD in your computer and having it turn it into having the iTunes do it for you.
Yeah,
I've never thought about that. But
there are different
I don't know if they're doing that
there
yet.
are different encoder algorithms, and I also read that if you use like a bigger word length when you're making an MP3, that you get a better quality MP3, and I've been experimenting with that, and it seems to be the case.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
What are you referring to when you say bigger word length? I mean, I'm looking at 16-bit versus 24-bit,
Mm-hmm.
41 versus 48.
The word length is how many bits each is in each sample.
Okay.
So modern converters that you record into are usually 24 bits, and that gives you that many more numbers to represent the dynamic range, and also the ambient information that's in the music, all the little nuances that you may not overtly hear, but when you take it away, you notice. Then internally in a workstation, when everything's being processed, a lot of workstations will process it at an even higher word length for greater accuracy. It's numerical accuracy. So there's something called 32-bit floating point, and a lot of workstations work like that, and it just helps preserve the depth and dimension of the sound. And if you have the opportunity when you render or bounce or whatever that making a mix process is, to keep it at 24 or 32-bit or 32-bit floating point, you're going to get a better mix down. I have to say data file because you're not going to be able to take that and put it on a CD, but you're going to get a better file that you can send to a mastering engineer, and then they can do the final adjustments to make the whole record, if you're making a record, sound better, as opposed to sending them a bunch of 16-bit files, which has a much limited, it's just that there's less information there. It's a matter of the amount of information. With bit depth translates mainly in a dynamic range, and sample rate translates into frequency range. Does that make sense?
Think of it as like like a digital photo. You know how like you can have you can look at a digital photo and it might look this big, but then you click on it and it gets this big and it's got all of that. And yeah, or you can look at a digital photo and then blow it up and it looks like a Monet painting. You can't even see anything in it. It's just all blurry. So apply that to like music. Think of that. You want the big picture. Even if you're going to look at it this big, you're going to have more detail if you take a really big picture and keep it as a really big picture, as opposed to like shrinking it down so you can email it. If that makes any sense, analogy-wise.
I have this urge to sing I've Got Music, I've Got Algorithms, I've got my girl who could ask for anything more.
Well, this is one of the crazy things about musicians engineering and producing their own stuff now, because you're dealing with all of these crazy technical things that, I mean, do you want to be a musician or do you want to be a damn scientist, you know? So, you know, I try not to get too immersed in all of this technical stuff, but unfortunately it's something that if you don't pay attention to it, things will get away from you. So there are some good books that are available that will go into detail about all this and explain it. Well, actually, a couple I've seen that used Ovis's digital photograph metaphor, which is, very accurate, actually.
So what we're saying is that it pays to hire a professional to deal with all these headaches instead of doing it yourself, if you want. But
Good point. If you have the money for it.
Yeah.
Jeremy, you guys you're working with all analog equipment, or are you actually running workstations with anything?
And we have Pro Tools, and we have 2-inch analog machines. We have half-inch machines and quarter-inch machines. And interesting, John Hampton just did. He mixed this live video for the Dead Weather, and then he went to Jack's studio just south of Nashville to do some more work with the band. And Jack has a 2-inch 8-track analog machine, which I don't know existed in the world prior to, unless it was some movie application or sound for movies, but back in the day, 8-track was a 1-inch format that Jack has used a lot. But it's, with regard to analog versus digital and 8-tracks versus 16 versus 24 and all that, I think Jack just liked the limitations of 8-track. You have to think differently when you record, and that could affect the creative process rather than, when we did our last record called In Space, we tracked to 24-track 2-inch tape, and just because we liked the way that sounded. But then we transferred to Pro Tools format, and one of the reasons is Ken and Stringfellow and John Auer stepped out in the studio to do background vocals, and Jeff Powell engineered the session, and Jeff said, "How many tracks do you think you'll need?" And Ken goes, "Well, about 18. And so they proceeded to do these vocals just brilliantly. And if we'd stuck to an analog format for that, it would have taken a while. But, that just kind of facilitated their getting that vocal work done pretty quickly. I don't know. It's you hear things, and if you really love the way it sounds, it's doesn't really matter how it was done. So, it'd be nice to sit down and listen to a series of things and kind of identify what you really like in terms of sonics. maybe not in terms of performances and that sort of thing, although it's hard to separate the two. But and then then you can kind of figure out, okay, well, how was this project done? Was it totally analog, totally digital, and kind of figure out how you want to do things for yourself. But I kind of, oh, thank you. I think we're done with this session. Thanks so much for coming out.